Hi everyone, Sarah Northrup here with Taylor Cowell. We're from Texas Panhandle Centers for Behavioral and Developmental Health. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and one of the topics that we feel like is very important, as does Mental Health of America, is dealing with life after trauma and stress. And I think we can all relate to what trauma means. A trauma is a trauma is a trauma. So Taylor and I wanted to talk a little bit about dealing with that in day-to-day life. So Taylor, thanks for joining me today.
Of course, yeah. Like you just said, trauma is different for everyone, and the way people experience it is going to affect them in different ways. Some people may experience a lot of trauma throughout their life, but be able to function normally, have good coping skills, maybe good support, while others may have only had a few, but it really takes a toll on them, and it's something that they carry, throughout their daily lives.
So when people hear post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, that brings up a lot of connotations.
Mm-hmm.
So most of us think about war,
Yep.
disaster, emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to make sure that if it's traumatic to me,
Yeah.
it's a traumatic experience, no matter what the circumstance is. Could be a car wreck, it could be just anything that's significant. It could be a death in the family. It could be a lot of things, but it's really about what my response might be.
Yeah, I'll give a good example too of that. Like you just said, most people think it's something with a war, a natural disaster, the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. But there's a story I heard where this person, she got a phone call from her friend that her mom had died, and so now every time she sees that name pop in her phone, it triggers that kind of response in her body, that kind of panicky fight or flight mode. Oh my gosh, is she calling me about another person who has died? And that's just a good example of how something just as little as that. I mean, yes, it is obviously a very big event. That's a huge loss. But that simple trigger right there was something to kind of carry out through her entire life.
And it's the feelings are reignited.
Mm-hmm.
And what you talk about in fight or flight is, I don't want to feel that again.
Yeah.
So I will do just about anything that I can to avoid those feelings,
Mm-hmm.
because it does not feel good.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the things that people will do in order to avoid?
Well, one of the big things with anxiety disorders, PTSD, stuff like that, is avoidance. That's where phobias come into play. That's where, one of the core symptoms of PTSD is that maybe avoidance of school, maybe avoidance of work, stuff like that, to get away from those feelings, to not be triggered by it. And in reality, that's the normal thing to do to keep yourself and your body safe, right? That's what your brain is telling you. Hey, let's stay away from this. If we don't see it, if we don't hear from it, then it's not there.
Then nothing bad's going to happen.
Nothing bad's going to happen.
And so in that example that you gave, I might avoid picking up the phone
Mm-hmm.
from that particular person, that phone call.
Yeah.
I might avoid that person altogether.
Yeah.
Because all it does is bring up those feelings, and it feels bad and it feels scary.
Yeah, and it may just be, if she calls from there on after, maybe it's just something to check on you, right? And so the brain has a really tricky way of kind of making you not learn how to cope with these things in the appropriate ways, because it has learned a response, and that's the brain's job right there, is to learn.
And to keep me safe.
And to keep you safe, yeah.
And to keep me safe. So I want to
Absolutely.
avoid those feelings and that pain as much as possible.
Yeah.
So even given that example that you gave, the person might drink,
Mm-hmm.
do drugs,
Oh, yeah.
and again, isolate from other people,
Mm-hmm.
just to avoid those feelings.
Yeah.
So what's something that you could tell a person in order to help them kind of talk about that trauma and deal with that
Yeah.
to where it's more healthy?
Well, obviously one of the biggest things that you can do is going to a type of clinical practice, an agency that is informed on how to deal with trauma. You know, a lot of people think, you know, maybe if their friend or someone they know is had something like that happen to them, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional abuse, a disaster, war, it's like, okay, let's talk about it, right? And that's what everyone thinks is kind of the solution to getting over these traumatic events and, you know, creating better coping skills. When in reality, that's not the case. Talking about these events, like if me and you are talking right now, is just as triggering as when it actually happened. It doesn't solve anything. It brings up those feelings, like again, the fight or flight mode, that panicky type feeling, and doesn't really solve the core issue, which is that trauma is always going to be there. But it's really how you deal with it. You know, how do you deal with the after effects of it, which is why we're here today, is to talk about it, you know. And so from there on out, it's really learning, okay, I know what my triggers are. I need to learn how to deal with them. Because they're going to come. I'm gonna run into these things at some point or another. I can't always avoid it.
So it's almost about experiencing the feelings, then nothing bad happens on the other side.
Yeah.
Like actually kind of coming face to face with the feelings.
Yeah.
And there's a different outcome.
Yeah.
And so it's working with people, licensed professionals that have experience working with trauma victims, and not just anybody off the street to kind of rip that Band-Aid off of this particular situation, because this can lead to even more trauma.
Exactly.
Correct? So we call that trauma-informed care.
Yeah.
And
Perfect.
so our agency is a trauma-informed care mental health center, so you want to make sure that people are working with those professionals in these particular circumstances.
Exactly. I mean, you're putting salt in the wound when we're just talking about the event, and so, and that's kind of called sometimes people will call that, you know, exposure therapy, right? Talking about all these things and kind of getting them in similar situations that would trigger that response. You know, one of the biggest or one of the most researched therapies that are out there is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is changing the thoughts surrounding your behaviors, right? So if you were younger and there was a lot of physical abuse, and now your thoughts are dictated around kind of those events, it's changed the way you talk to people, maybe the way you function at work. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is there to help change those distorted thoughts into a healthier, more productive way of looking at kind of that trauma.
And also, too, trauma-informed cognitive behavior therapy is specialized care for people who have experienced a trauma.
Yeah.
On the other hand of that, what if we're working with people and they do not want to work on a traumatic situation or traumatic feelings? I mean, how do you address that when you think, gosh, this would really be helpful to that person and get them moving on down, you know, the road? What do you do with that?
Well, you have to work with them on it. If they aren't ready to kind of challenge these thoughts, these distorted thinking patterns and tactics that they may have been using, you know, that's something that you can't force onto somebody, because no real change is going to happen. I mean, I don't know how to put a metaphor to it, but working with them where they're at is the most important thing. If they're not ready to talk about this, if they're not ready to change these thoughts, that's okay. There's other things to talk about.
It's what we say. It's
Yeah.
meeting people where they are.
Exactly.
And that is something that throughout our videos we've talked about, because you know, the person we're working with has to instigate that, has to have the buy-in, and be ready, willing, and able to participate in the process.
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to speak about trauma is, just because maybe someone isn't diagnosed with PTSD does not mean that they have experienced trauma, right? And I know it kind of goes back to that thing we said in the beginning, where it's trauma is different for every person. But even just one event can really change the path that someone goes down in life.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And how you respond, how you react, how you deal with others, your relationships.
Yeah.
It's just something that you just pick up and carry with you.
Yeah.
And think it's so important that we're talking about this today, Taylor. So thank you so much. Where can people get in touch with us about more trauma-informed care?
Well, our intake line is 806, what is it, 357?
337-1000.
1000, there we go.
And a crisis hotline number, 806-359-6699.